January 11, 1944. 10:22 a.m. Above Oschersleben, Germany. The air is 20 below zero, thin, sharp, and deadly. High above the white earth, a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses pushes toward the target. The AGO Flugzeugwerk plant, lifeline of the Luftwaffe's FW-190 fighters. 70 bombers, silver and proud, flying in formation tighter than courage itself. But there's something missing in that sky. The escorts. The P-47s have turned back. Fuel limits. Miscommunication. It doesn't matter now. Because down there, radar stations have already seen them coming. And the hunters are climbing to meet them. Staff Sergeant Harold McVeigh, waist gunner of the Sweet Rose of Texas, peers through the frost-rimmed window. His world is vibration and cold metal. The oxygen mask bites his face, his hands are numb around the grips of twin .50 caliber Brownings. Each trigger press shakes the ship like thunder. He hears the warning through the interphone, bandits, 9 o'clock high. Every man in the plane knows what's coming. The German fighters won't circle. They'll dive straight in, guns blazing, cannon shells walking toward the bomber formation in long, burning lines. McVeigh swings his guns. He's trained for this. He's done the drills, the endless hours behind a grounded turret in New Mexico. He lines up the tiny circle of his optical sight, breath steady, finger ready. Then the first Focke-Wulf screams down from the sun. He fires. Misses. Fires again. Misses again. The bomber shudders under the stress. The sight fogs. The target vanishes before he can adjust. The vibrations make the reticle dance. Another fighter flashes past. The sound of impact, cannon shells tearing through the fuselage. Aluminum peels away like paper. McVeigh ducks, glass raining across his shoulders. He tries once more, center the sight, lead the target, squeeze. The tracers go wide. It's useless. The sight means nothing in this chaos. Something inside him snaps. He rips his eyes away from the sight, lifts his head and follows the tracers instead, glowing orange streaks burning through the blue. He fires short bursts, watches the pattern, adjusts by instinct. The next line of tracers curves, intersects the diving fighter, and suddenly the Focke-Wulf erupts into fire. The black cross disintegrates into smoke. McVeigh freezes. He didn't aim. He didn't measure. He felt it. He presses the trigger again. Another burst. Another German fighter crosses his path, and again he follows the tracers, correcting by reflex, not by formula. Flames. Falling wreckage. 2 kills. No sight. He can barely comprehend it. Every manual, every lecture, every instructor had told him, trust the sight. But up here the manuals don't matter. Up here your life depends on how fast you can feel the rhythm of chaos. All around him the sky is dissolving. Fortresses burn. Men fall. Over the interphone voices overlap, some praying, some shouting coordinates, some screaming names. And through the madness one voice cuts clear, forget the sight. Watch your tracers. McVeigh isn't alone. Across the formation, other gunners are doing the same thing. Waist gunners, top turret, ball turret, all ignoring their optics, firing by instinct, using the bright trails to walk their fire into the enemy. It's primitive. It's desperate. And it works. The next wave of FW-190s dives head-on into the formation. Dozens of Brownings open up in response, tracer lines weaving a deadly web through the sky. The air smells of cordite and cold oil. One German fighter explodes mid-air. Another spins out trailing black smoke. For every fortress that falls, 1 or 2 attackers go down with it. What was supposed to be a massacre turns into something else. A gunfight fought not by numbers but by instinct. McVeigh doesn't think anymore. He reacts. He knows where the plane's vibration will throw his aim, knows when to fire a half-second early to let the tracers find their mark. His breath follows the rhythm of the guns. The sight dangles uselessly to the side, a relic of peacetime logic. For the first time he feels control inside the uncontrollable. Minutes stretch like hours. The bombers drop their payload. The fighters break off, regroup, attack again. Flak bursts above, below, everywhere. The formation bleeds men and metal. But somehow Sweet Rose of Texas survives. Half her tail is shredded, one engine coughing smoke, but she's still flying. And McVeigh, soaked in sweat beneath layers of freezing gear, keeps shooting. Keeps trusting what no one ever taught him. The human sense of where death will be one heartbeat ahead. When they finally break free of enemy range, silence returns. The interphone hums with static. Someone whispers, "We made it." Another voice replies, "Barely." Later, at the debrief, officers tally the results. 12 bombers lost. 100 men gone. But something stands out. The surviving crews report a kill rate far above the norm, almost 40% higher. The analysts can't explain it. No new weapon. No new sight. Just a handful of gunners who, under the worst conditions imaginable, stopped doing what they were told and started doing what they felt. That was the day instinct beat technology. And in the thin air over Germany, a quiet revolution was born. It would never appear in a field manual. No report would ever credit it. But among the men who flew and fought, word spread quickly. You don't aim, you feel. You don't calculate, you adapt. They called it snap shooting, hip shooting, or sometimes just blind luck. But those who used it knew better. Luck had nothing to do with it. It was human instinct, sharpened by terror, refined by repetition, unleashed by desperation. For the rest of the war, it would whisper through the barracks and briefings. Crews began ignoring the sights more often, relying on tracers, rhythm, and muscle memory. The engineers back home had built a machine of precision, but the men inside it had discovered something more powerful: the will to survive on their own terms. McVeigh didn't think of himself as an innovator. He was just a man trying not to die in a sky full of burning aluminum. But in that frozen hour above Oschersleben, he and hundreds like him redefined the art of aerial defense. They proved that the line between survival and extinction wasn't drawn by manuals, it was drawn by instinct. And that instinct would change everything. What happens when war strips away every rule? When the difference between life and death comes down to the twitch of a finger and the flash of a tracer. This is the story of the men who stopped aiming and started surviving. If you want to know how desperation turned soldiers into innovators, and how the chaos of combat rewrote the science of air warfare, subscribe now. Because in the skies of World War II, evolution didn't wait for peace. It happened at 20,000 feet in the middle of hell. Before the instinct, there was doctrine. Before chaos, there was confidence. In 1942, as the United States built its air war over Europe, everything rested on precision. The Army Air Forces believed that technology could outthink fear, that a perfect machine, guided by trained men and perfect instruments, could crush the enemy from above. Every gunner was a cog in that system. Every movement measured. Every bullet calculated. In the desert of New Mexico, at the training bases of Las Vegas, Kingman, and Laredo, thousands of young men learned to shoot at clay targets pulled by trucks, to align perfect rings on still silhouettes. They memorized range charts, wind drift formulas, and the mathematics of deflection shooting. They were told that mastery of the sight meant mastery of the air. The device they trusted most was a small glass-ringed circle, the optical gun sight. It was designed to make chaos predictable. Instructors said, "Keep both eyes open, center the target in the ring, squeeze gently, never jerk." The manuals promised accuracy. The charts promised results. And in the classroom it all made sense. The sight turned combat into geometry. But geometry dies in turbulence. The first missions over France and Germany shattered those lessons. Inside a B-17, the world didn't sit still. The plane shook with every engine's vibration. The cold froze metal, cracked lenses, and numbed hands. The guns weren't mounted in labs, they were bolted into the skin of a fortress that trembled like a living thing. A German fighter didn't appear as a clean silhouette. It came at 400 miles an hour, rolling, diving, weaving through flak bursts, its guns already firing. The optical ring couldn't predict that. A split second late and the target was gone. After every mission, crews landed white-faced, staring through the frost of their masks. Reports came in: wasted ammunition, missed opportunities, gunners swearing the sight was useless. Officers dismissed it as fatigue, fear, or poor training. But word spread through the barracks: the damn sight's no good in the real fight. By 1943, the European skies had become a slaughterhouse. The 8th Air Force lost more than 200 bombers in a single month. Thousands of men vanished into clouds of smoke and fire. For every fortress that returned, another never came home. To the engineers, the solution was simple: refine the tools. They introduced new designs: the N8A reflector sight, the Mark 9, improved reticles, better mounting stabilizers. On paper it worked. But the men flying into enemy territory knew otherwise. No matter the model, no matter the manual, nothing could keep up with the speed of death. The air war over Europe was not the clean, mathematical war America had imagined. It was a war of nerves, fought in -40-degree temperatures, with oxygen running low and frost creeping across the glass. A waist gunner had seconds to react, maybe less. He couldn't recite equations. He couldn't think about angles. He had to feel. It started quietly, a few gunners here, a few there, ignoring the sight when the attack came. They fired short bursts, corrected by watching their tracers. Every fifth bullet glowed, a tiny burning line of reference. Tracers became their language, their instinct, their heartbeat. Don't aim, one would say. Watch where your fire goes, then walk it in. It sounded reckless. It looked primitive. But results spoke louder than lectures. Some crews began to stand out. Their hit rates doubled. Pilots noticed they came home more often. Intelligence officers noticed their gunnery logs, fewer rounds fired, more confirmed kills. Still, official doctrine refused to acknowledge it. To admit that instinct was outperforming design meant admitting that the entire foundation of strategic air warfare, precision, discipline, control, was flawed. But up there, theory meant nothing. At 20,000 feet, a man didn't care about doctrine. He cared about staying alive long enough to see England again. Those who survived knew the truth. The best shooters weren't always the best students. They were the ones who could forget everything when the sky exploded, the ones who trusted their eyes, their reflexes, and their fear. One instructor at Kingman later confessed, years after the war, "We trained them to be machines. But the best of them fought like animals. That's why they lived." For the gunners, instinct was not rebellion. It was evolution. The Luftwaffe forced it. German tactics were merciless. They learned to attack from the sun, from blind spots, from below the formation where no sight could help. They came in at speeds beyond the sight's predictive range. By the time a gunner aligned the ring, the enemy was already gone, or his plane was already on fire. So the Americans adapted. By mid-1943, unofficial techniques spread through word of mouth. Crews returning from brutal missions told the new arrivals, "Forget the books. Follow the tracers. Feel the ship." They called it shooting from the gut. And slowly, without any memo, without any order, the doctrine began to change, not in headquarters but in the air itself. For the men inside those planes, it wasn't theory. It was survival. A waist gunner's world was a coffin of aluminum, barely wide enough to turn around. The guns rattled like jackhammers, the empty shells piled around his boots. The cold made every breath hurt. Above the roar, all he could hear was his own pulse. He didn't have time to think. He didn't need to. He had learned something deeper, that fear could sharpen more precisely than any lens. The B-17 was a machine of symmetry. 10 men, 10 stations, each watching a different direction. The bombardier looked forward. The navigator traced lines across a map. The gunners looked outward, always outward, toward death coming in from all sides. Every mission was a test of balance between trust in the machine and trust in themselves. At first, command resisted change. They warned crews against wild firing, insisted that the sight remained essential. But as the war ground on, the data became undeniable. Squadrons that embraced instinctive shooting had higher survival rates. Fewer wasted rounds. More confirmed kills. No one wrote it into doctrine. But among the men it was already gospel. By late 1943, this quiet revolution reached almost every bomb group in the 8th Air Force. From Oschersleben to Schweinfurt, from Bremen to Berlin, American gunners were fighting by feel, an army of men who no longer trusted the rules written for them. They had entered a new phase of the war, one not defined by design or strategy, but by the human capacity to adapt faster than the machine could break. Some called it luck. Others called it madness. But the results were real. Kill ratios climbed. Morale briefly lifted. For every fortress that fell, more Luftwaffe pilots went down with them. Yet beneath the numbers, something deeper was shifting. A change not in weapons but in philosophy. The air war had begun as a war of perfection. Now it was becoming a war of imperfection, where the flawed, trembling hands of frightened men were finding a way to outshoot the system built to control them. In that contradiction lay the truth of modern war. The closer technology tried to replace humanity, the harder humanity fought to survive without it. And as the smoke thickened over Europe, that truth began to define the skies. The instinct wasn't just saving lives. It was rewriting the rules of war itself. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. Not because of new planes. Not because of better guns. But because of how men chose to fight. What began as whispers in the barracks had become something like a creed. Gunners no longer looked through the glass rings of their optical sights. They looked around them, feeling every vibration, judging distance by instinct, tracking death not by formula but by rhythm. It had no manual, no signature, no author. But the men called it the gut rule. And it worked. Squadrons that adopted it survived longer, shot straighter, and came home more often. Crews that clung to the old ways, the ones who still tried to line up the perfect shot through trembling glass, too often never came back. The command at High Wycombe tried to deny it. Reports of undisciplined firing filled the debrief rooms. Intelligence officers called it combat panic. Gunnery instructors dismissed it as reckless improvisation. But data had no loyalty. Every combat film, every gun camera reel told the same story. The best hits didn't come from men following procedure. They came from those who abandoned it. In the 303rd Bomb Group, a waist gunner named Harold Red Keane became a quiet legend. He wasn't the best student. Barely passed his gunnery course. But once over Germany he hit 3 fighters in 2 missions, all without using the sight. In one debrief when asked how he did it, Keane just shrugged, didn't think. Just felt it. His crew backed him up. He never missed. His pilot added, he doesn't shoot like a gunner. He shoots like he knows what's coming. Word spread. Crews started calling gunners like Keane, natural shots. They became mythic figures. The men who could see a fighter before anyone else, who could anticipate its dive, who moved their guns before the enemy even appeared in the glass. At first the officers tried to hide it. Then they tried to study it. Instructors from the gunnery schools were flown to England to observe these instinct shooters. What they found was disturbing to the system. There was no repeatable method. No measurable formula. Every man did it differently. Some aimed slightly ahead, others followed the tracers, some even fired blind from reflex the moment a shadow crossed the glass. It couldn't be standardized. It couldn't be trained in a classroom. But it worked better than anything they'd ever taught. For the first time, the Air Force faced a truth it didn't want to admit. The most effective weapon in the air war wasn't a machine. It was human intuition under pressure. And it was rewriting everything. In May 1944, during the raids over Schweinfurt, the 100th Bomb Group, nicknamed the Bloody 100th, became a case study in survival. The group had suffered catastrophic losses in 1943, nearly wiped out on multiple missions. By now, only veterans and replacements filled its ranks. They were tired, cynical, and they didn't trust doctrine anymore. Their gunners fought on instinct alone. On the third raid, a formation of 39 fortresses was attacked by more than 100 Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. For 15 minutes, the sky was madness, contrails, tracers, and black flak bursts tearing across the horizon. But the 100th didn't break. Post-mission analysis later showed that their gunners had fired fewer rounds than any other group that day, and yet scored the highest number of kills. The secret? No one had used the sight. It became undeniable. Behind closed doors, a quiet order began to circulate. Encourage gunners to rely on field judgment when under duress. That was the official phrasing. Unofficially it meant, let them shoot how they survive. The war was forcing evolution faster than training could keep up. Even the engineers began to notice. Men who designed the optical sights received field reports covered in frost, soot, and blood, returned with scrawled notes like useless in combat, or glass froze again, or threw it out mid-mission. A few of those engineers traveled to England. Among them was a young technician named Romano, quiet, precise, the kind of man who believed in systems, not superstition. He arrived at a base near Bassingbourn, carrying boxes of new reflector sight prototypes meant to fix the human error problem. What he found instead was something no machine could fix. He saw men with frostbite scars on their hands, joking about death between missions. He saw them strip the sights off their mounts, toss them into crates and say, "Tell the lab boys thanks, but we'll use our eyes." At first he thought they were fools. Then he flew with them. The first time a Messerschmitt came diving in from the sun, Romano watched the gunner fire before the enemy even appeared in the frame. The German fighter rolled through the tracers and its wings snapped clean off. Romano never forgot that moment. He'd spent years building instruments to predict motion, But he'd just seen a man feel it instead. Back at the field, he stopped defending his inventions. He started asking questions. What if, he wondered, the problem wasn't the gunners, but the sights themselves? What if the human brain, under the right conditions, was faster than glass and metal? It was heresy to his peers. But to the men flying every day it made perfect sense. By mid-1944, this quiet understanding connected crews across the 8th Air Force like a secret language. They didn't talk about it openly, not in debriefs, not in reports. But among themselves it was law. Trust your gut. Forget the sight. Feel the ship. And Romano, the engineer who came to fix their problem, was now trying to understand it. He began collecting accounts, flight logs, tracer patterns, trying to find logic and instinct. He wasn't just curious, he was obsessed. If he could find a way to bridge instinct and design, maybe he could build something better, a sight that didn't slow the shooter down, that amplified his reflex instead of replacing it. But the war was moving faster than his research. Every week, new missions, new losses, new data written in blood. Still, he worked, sketching ideas between raids, listening to the veterans, learning their habits. He realized something fundamental. When a gunner fired by instinct, his eyes weren't fixed on the sight at all. They were open, scanning, processing motion, light, and timing all at once. It wasn't random. It was deeply trained chaos. Romano began calling it predictive perception, the mind's ability to calculate motion subconsciously faster than instruments could. He'd seen it in fighters, boxers, and baseball players before the war. But here, at 20,000 feet, it was the difference between life and death. And he started to believe that maybe instinct wasn't the enemy of technology. Maybe it was the missing half of it. While the generals still argued about procedure, men like Romano were watching evolution happen in real time, not in factories but in the frozen gun turrets of the Flying Fortress. The Germans never knew it, but by 1944 they weren't just fighting machines. They were fighting men who had learned to think faster than machines could respond. The doctrine of precision was dying. And from its wreckage, a new kind of warfare was being born. One that blurred the line between man and mechanism, between discipline and desperation. In the cold, silver skies over Europe, the instinct had become more than survival. It had become a weapon of its own. By late summer 1944, the war was reaching its fever pitch. The Luftwaffe was dying, but not quietly. What was left of its fighter wings was desperate, lethal, and filled with men who'd learned to die fast and strike faster. And somewhere in the chaos, inside a drafty hangar at Bassingbourn, the quiet engineer named Romano was preparing something that no one in command had asked for. He wasn't trying to build a miracle. He was trying to understand one. Every night after the missions, when crews dragged themselves off the trucks, faces raw from the cold, eyes burned from the sun and smoke, Romano sat with them. He listened, not to their victories but to how they saw. How they felt a plane moving before it moved. How they knew when to fire without ever finding the crosshair. He filled notebooks with sketches and angles, overlaying instinct with mechanics. A reflection, not a reticle. A simple glass that floated the target where the mind already knew it would be. He scavenged parts from wrecked turrets, mirrored lenses from downed fighters, even shards of plexiglass scavenged off a crashed P-47. By dawn, he had something that wasn't regulation, wasn't tested, wasn't even safe. But it might work. He didn't tell command. He told McVeigh. The same waste gunner who had once ripped the sight off his gun over Oschersleben. The man who'd proven, by chance or by genius, that human instinct could outfight precision. When Romano showed him the glass, a flat, curved plate with a faint reflective tint, McVeigh frowned. "You want me to use another damn sight?" Romano shook his head. "Not to aim with, to feel with." It wasn't about fixing the old system. It was about meeting instinct halfway. 2 weeks later the chance to test it came. August 12, 1944. The target was a marshalling yard near Munich. Heavy resistance expected. 60 B-17s in the formation. Flak over the Alps, fighters inbound from every compass point. Romano hitched a ride aboard the Lucky Lady, McVeigh's new crew. He wasn't on the roster. He just slipped into the radio compartment, clutching the crude prototype wrapped in canvas. As they climbed past 20,000 feet, frost forming on the turret glass, he helped mount the sight on the right waist gun. Improvised brackets, bolted to steel that still smelled of cordite. McVeigh looked through it once. The reflection shimmered like heat over sand. "Don't know what I'm seeing," "You're not supposed to," Romano said. "Just fight." The formation reached the target at 1,125 hours. The first flak burst hit near the lead ship, black smoke, orange sparks. Then the fighters came. FW-190s, high-speed dives from 11 o'clock high, cannon shells carving white arcs through the contrails. McVeigh swung the gun around. Romano crouched beside him, notebook forgotten, frozen in place. The German came screaming in, closing fast. McVeigh didn't look through the ring, didn't chase the blur. He focused on the shimmer in front of the glass, the reflection of the fighter floating exactly where it would be. He squeezed the trigger. Tracer lines rose through the cold, met the reflection, and the fighter exploded before it could even fire. Romano's ears rang. McVeigh was already tracking another. Short burst. Controlled. Every hit clean. It wasn't magic. It was synchronization. The glass, the motion, the human reflex all working as one. By the time the attack ended, 5 enemy fighters were down. The Lucky Lady returned with its skin torn, one engine shot out, but alive. That night, Romano sat alone outside the hangar, hands shaking, the smell of burnt oil still on his clothes. He stared at the shattered remains of his prototype, cracked from vibration. It had lasted one mission. But it had proven everything. In his report, never officially filed, he wrote a single sentence: "The human eye and the machine must meet in motion, not in stillness." Within weeks he was ordered back to the States. His design would vanish into files, renamed, refined, and forgotten beneath layers of bureaucracy. But word of that mission spread across the bomber groups like a ghost story. Gunners began tinkering again, polishing old reflectors from P-38s, welding glass plates to their turrets, copying what they'd heard about the sight that sees where you will. Nobody called it innovation. They called it survival. And though few would ever meet Romano again, his idea, half instinct, half invention, would resurface months later in new designs. The K-14, the N9, the first true Euro-reflector gun sights. They'd bear no signature, no name. But every time a tracer found its mark, a small part of that frozen experiment over Munich lived on. By winter the air war was changing again. Fewer bombers were falling. The kill ratios had swung. Gunners were hitting more, faster, with fewer rounds. Fighter pilots reported unnatural accuracy from the fortresses, as if they'd learned to see the future. And maybe they had. Because for men like McVeigh, sight and instinct were no longer separate. They were one. Yet for every success there was a cost. The same men who mastered that instinct were breaking inside. They no longer saw the enemy as pilots, just shapes, shadows, motion. The reflex that saved them also hollowed them. McVeigh once said in a letter home, "I don't aim anymore. I just know. And sometimes when I close my eyes I still see the tracers." The Air Force would later praise their accuracy, publish the statistics, call it proof of superior training. But no report ever mentioned the toll, the sleepless nights, the trembling hands, the silence after landing when no one could meet each other's eyes. War had made them faster than fear. But not immune to it. By early 1945 Romano's sight, or rather its descendants, were being tested across Europe. Reflector technology had become standard in fighters, then adapted for bombers. The irony was cruel. What began as rebellion had become doctrine. What began as instinct had become policy. But the men who started it never saw themselves as innovators. They were just trying to live long enough to fly home. When victory finally came, most of them scattered, back to farms, to factories, to quiet towns where nobody talked about the noise. Romano returned to New Jersey, took a job designing civilian optics, never mentioning what he'd built. McVeigh went back to Kansas, opened a gas station, and kept a small glass lens on his workbench, cracked and cloudy. He never said where it came from. History forgot them. But the planes didn't. Every gun sight that followed, every modern heads-up display, every pilot who ever aimed through a reflection rather than a reticle, owed something to those frozen men in 1944 who learned to see without seeing. And beneath all the data, the manuals, and the medals, a single truth remained: when the machines failed, instinct saved them. They didn't call it progress. They called it survival. When the war finally ended, the air over Europe went silent. No contrails. No engines. No tracer fire cutting through the clouds. Just a stillness that felt unnatural to men who had lived with thunder in their ears. For thousands of airmen, silence was the hardest sound of all. Those who had survived came home different. They carried no banners, no speeches, just the quiet knowledge that something inside them had changed, something no parade could ever cleanse. Harold McVeigh never talked about his missions. He kept his jacket folded in the attic, metals untouched. Sometimes, when the wind hit the tin roof just right, he would pause as if hearing engines again. In the corner of his workbench sat that cracked piece of glass, the one Romano had made for him. It was cloudy now, the edges worn smooth by time. But when sunlight hit it just right, it still caught the light like it did that morning over Munich. To anyone else it was junk. To him it was proof that for a few impossible minutes, instinct had been enough to outwit death. Romano lived a quiet life too. He never patented anything. Never lectured. The war had taken away his certainty. He stopped believing that perfection could be engineered. But he never stopped thinking about the men who'd shown him something machines never could. The speed of human intuition, the genius of desperation. Sometimes, when he spoke to students decades later, he would mention it only in passing. The hardest part, he'd say, is knowing when to stop trusting the tool and start trusting yourself. He knew they wouldn't understand. You couldn't unless you'd lived in that frozen sky where the air was filled with tracers and time itself seemed to bend. By the 1950s the world had moved on. Jet engines replaced propellers. Radar replaced guesswork. Gun sights became digital, heads-up, automatic. Pilots no longer had to feel the motion, they just read the data. But every new machine still carried a trace of that old lesson. The reflection on the glass, the illusion of alignment, the fragile bridge between man and machine. The engineers called it innovation. The veterans called it memory. And yet, even in peace, the question remained, had war pushed them forward, or had it broken something human to make room for progress? The reflex that once saved them had come at a cost. Many of the instinct shooters struggled afterward. Their minds still tracked motion in empty skies, seeing shapes in clouds, feeling the urge to fire when birds cut across the horizon. Some never escaped it. Psychologists later gave it names. Back then they just called it the shakes. But the truth was simpler. They had learned to think faster than fear, and you can't unlearn that. In 1963, during a test of the new F-4 Phantom, a young pilot looked through his Euro-reflective HUD and said over the radio, "It's strange, it feels like the plane's doing the aiming for me." An older observer on the ground, gray-haired and silent, smiled faintly. It was Romano. He didn't say a word. He just watched as the jet banked and fired, its tracers bending toward the target exactly the way McVeigh's had 20 years earlier. Progress had caught up with instinct. But only because instinct had led the way. History never wrote about the gunners who disobeyed their training, or the engineer who followed them into the sky. Their names were buried under tonnage reports and kill ratios. But their fingerprints are everywhere, on every modern targeting system, every computer-assisted sight, every display that reflects not what is but what will be. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them in the silence between each new invention. The men who fought not just the enemy but the limits of their own design. The war had been a machine that demanded order. Yet, in its chaos, it was chaos itself that saved them. Romano once wrote in a private note long after the war, "Instinct is not the opposite of logic. It is logic compressed by fear." That line was never published. But it remains the truest thing anyone ever said about aerial war. Because up there, above the flak and the fire, there was no time for calculation. No time for sight lines or degrees. There was only the blur of movement, the pull of gravity, and the fraction of a second where a man had to decide whether to trust the machine, or the trembling in his own hands. And when he did, that was when he lived. It's easy now to look back and see innovation as a timeline, a steady climb from one design to the next. But the truth is darker. Progress didn't rise smoothly from brilliance. It was torn from fear, hammered out in the heat of survival, shaped by men who had no choice but to adapt faster than death could reach them. The B-17 gunners who threw away their sights didn't know they were changing history. They only knew they were dying too fast to keep doing it the old way. And in that crucible of terror, they proved something the textbooks never taught, that courage and creation are often the same thing. Every tracer that cut through the sky wasn't just a bullet. It was a lesson written in light. Every miss a correction. Every hit, a moment of clarity. And in the middle of that chaos, somewhere between the machine and the man, a new kind of seeing was born. In 1944 it saved lives. In the decades that followed it shaped technology. And today, It still whispers to anyone who dares to look through the glass and trust what they feel more than what they see. Because instinct doesn't die. It evolves. Every pilot who flies today owes something to those men in the frozen sky, the ones who refused to obey, who turned fear into precision, who aimed not with their eyes but with their courage. Their legacy isn't made of medals or manuals. It's made of motion. It's the human element inside every instrument, the quiet pulse inside every machine. When the world tells you to follow the system, remember them, the gunners who ignored their sights and found a way to survive. And if you've stayed with this story until now, remember to keep following the untold ones too. Because history isn't just about what we built. It's about what we became when everything we built stopped working. Subscribe to uncover more stories of the men who defied logic, who rewrote war with instinct, and who showed that sometimes, the greatest invention, is the human mind itself. The skies above Europe are quiet now. But if you close your eyes, you can still see it, the orange trails arcing across the blue, the rhythm of breath and recoil, the heartbeat between fear and fire. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all. That even in the most mechanical war the world had ever known, the final victory still belonged to something no machine could replace. The pulse of instinct.